Episode 10, Lies, Loss, and Lawsuits, the Season 1 finale. The content of this podcast is based on my personal experiences, my own interpretations, and the information that I have been told or discovered for myself. These accounts reflect my perspective and understanding of events as I live them. Everyone mentioned is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Nothing shared here should be taken as a legal judgment, a definitive statement of fact, or a formal accusation. This podcast is intended for storytelling and documentation of my journey. And while I strive for accuracy, listeners should understand that these are my views and recollections. Before Lois died, she gave us an answer that confirmed our worst fears. We asked her, "Why do you think they are waiting for you to die?" Her reply was chilling. She said, "Because that's exactly what Melissa told me." I later spoke with Chet, and he confirmed it. He'd heard the same words for himself. It all started when Lois confronted Melissa about the $450,000 she knew she had taken out of her account, which later we discovered the true number to be even higher. Melissa snapped back, threatening to sell the Bass Lake house, but without accounting for Chet and Lois's 28% stake in the house. Lois was firm. She told her flat out, "If you sell it, we'll take our share and you could keep the rest." It was the same type of agreement Chet and Lois had with me for my house, but Melissa didn't think those rules applied to her. She was quick to call me a thief, but the truth was staring her in the face. Aggravated and defiant, she lashed out. "Fine, I'll just wait for you to die," she said. And not long after, Melissa and Darren made their message loud and clear. They mailed artwork that my parents had at the Bass Lake house back to Chet and Lois, along with a wooden welcome sign with my parents' names on it. The message was unmistakable. "You're not welcome here anymore." Not a decision that they were unilaterally allowed to make. That wasn't the only chilling moment in those days. The night Lois passed away, something else happened that showed just how far Darren would go. Before Darren ever put his hands on me at Chet and Lois's house, I had a brief moment to confront him about something that I knew he was lying about. I pulled out Chet's phone and showed him that he couldn't log into his own camera system. Darren quickly pushed the phone away, repeating the same excuse I had already heard. He didn't know the password. And then he added that Westcom Credit Union somehow controlled his personal Gmail account and that he'd have to ask them later. He tried to brush it off by saying that the cameras weren't working anyway. But I knew better. I have the exact same camera system at my house, and I know what the status lights mean, especially the ones that indicate when the cameras are actively being watched. Later that same night, after Lois passed away, Melissa and Darren left the house awkwardly before we did. I was still angry at Darren that he had grabbed me, but I wasn't going to give him the reaction he probably wanted. I wasn't going to let him bait me into a fight just so he could press charges. As I walked out of Chet and Lois's house, I looked back and I saw it. The cameras were blinking. That meant that someone was actively watching. It couldn't have been Chet because Darren never helped him regain access. It had to be Melissa or Darren. So I did something they would later accuse me of, although, ironically, it was the only time I had ever heard them tell the truth about it. If Darren wanted to claim the cameras didn't work, then I was going to call him out on his lie. I walked up to the first camera and tilted it down so it no longer had a clear view. Then I went to the second camera, which was also blinking, and did the same thing. For me, it wasn't about breaking anything. It was about proving the cameras were still live and that Darren and Melissa had been lying all along. The next day, Darren called Chet while my sister was there, and of course, Melissa was on the line too. Darren started out by saying that he wanted to talk to Chet about something important. He claimed he had been making calls to Social Security and Westcom, but had run into a roadblock. According to him, he was told that Ed was now Chet's power of attorney, which meant that he couldn't make those calls anymore. Chet didn't argue, and he could see where this was going. He explained that he and Lois had already discussed things with Amanda, their granddaughter, before Lois passed. Amanda was working in downtown LA at the time and needed to be close to her job. She wasn't going to live in Chet and Lois's house, even though she had shown interest years prior. And because Chet and Lois didn't want their house sold, They had decided together that they would leave it to their firstborn child, my mother, Kathy. This was important. My mom had never asked them for anything. Unlike her siblings, especially Melissa, she never begged, never demanded, and never expected. That respect and humility mattered to Chet and Lois. But Darren's story didn't add up. He was claiming he only learned about the change in power of attorney because of a phone call he made. Yet Melissa immediately jumped in and said that Amanda had been sad and cried when she found out that she wasn't getting the house, and claimed that Amanda never even talked to Chet. Think about that. How would Melissa know that Amanda was upset unless she had already known the contents of the new trust that had not been delivered to them nor even drafted yet? Had she been listening in on the conversations through those Alexa devices again? We will probably never know the truth, but we did know that they were served the papers telling them that they were not in charge anymore. For a moment, Darren almost sounded reasonable. He said he just wanted to confirm that Chet really wanted Ed to be his power of attorney. Chet calmly replied that he and Lois had made that decision before her passing. Darren said that he respected whatever Chet decided. Chet reaffirmed that again. Ed would be executor and power of attorney. And that's when Melissa burst out laughing, loudly. "Wow, how manipulative," she sneered. Even as Chet explained again that this was Lois's wish while she could still communicate, Melissa kept laughing, as if she was shocked and furious at the same time. Chet, who had just lost his wife a day earlier, tried to shut down the conflict. He asked for everyone to just love each other. His voice broke, and he cried to himself, clearly devastated. But Darren wouldn't let it go. He repeated, again, that he wanted to make sure that it was really Chet's decision, as though Chet wasn't capable of making one on his own. Then the conversation turned back to who would inherit the house. Chet mentioned Tiffany was a possibility, but noted the tax implications. Melissa jumped in again, demanding, "Why not split it 4 ways? Why does one person deserve everything?" she said. That's rich coming from her. She had no problem when the plan was for her daughter to get the house outright on her 25th birthday. But now that it wasn't going to Amanda, suddenly it needed to be shared. She even claimed that it didn't make sense to give it to someone that hadn't visited them in 5 years, conveniently ignoring the fact that there was a pandemic and Chet and Lois themselves had told people not to come. Chet tried again to calm things down, saying he didn't want the conflict. Melissa pressed. "Split it 4 ways, she said. Chet stood firm. He didn't want the house sold. That's when Darren jumped in with his final shot. He said, quote, "My only concern is, and I know you don't need the conflict, and I'm sorry, but EJ is a sociopath. He stole $250,000 from you, promised to repay it, hasn't repaid a penny. We were just very concerned." End quote. Way to keep it classy, Darren. Chet finally tried to steer the conversation in a different direction. He stopped them and said, "Speaking of EJ, he's been a lot of help." He started talking about how I would come over to the house and visit Lois before she passed, how I'd bring the kids over to lift their spirits, and how I'd helped him with the security cameras when he couldn't figure them out. Chet explained that I even pulled the numbers off the back of the cameras so that he could start regaining control of the system himself. He made it clear he didn't want to cause any conflict between me and them. And that's when Darren jumped in. He said, "EJ purposely repositioned 2 cameras and nothing is being recorded now." And here's the thing, he was actually right. I admit it, I did it, but I did it to prove a point. Those cameras were still live and being watched, even though Darren swore up and down that they didn't work. Darren brushed it off by saying that he was going to take care of the cameras the next day, though we all knew that that was never going to happen. Chet tried once more to calm things down. He said he didn't want the conflict and just wanted everyone to get along. Darren coldly replied, "Unfortunately, that's not going to happen." Chet went back to the heart of the issue. This was why he had decided to leave the house to Kathy. But Darren cut him off again, saying, "It doesn't matter who you give your stuff to. It's about who you want to assist you with your trust. And that's fine as long as it's actually your decision. There it was again. The same insinuation as if Chet couldn't think for himself. Chet firmly repeated that he and Lois both had made that decision together to have Ed serve as trustee and that he didn't want any conflict. Darren softened his voice and he said that he just wanted to make sure that Chet was okay. Then Melissa spoke up again, saying the only way to distribute the house fairly would be to split it among 4 people. Chet told her plainly that the only way to split it would be to sell it, and he didn't want that. Melissa insisted, why can't it be owned by 4 children? Why should one person get everything? Chet even tried to reassure her, telling her that she could come and stay in the house whenever she wanted, but Melissa snapped back. The LeClairs? I have no relationship with them. Chet, exhausted, tried to close things out. Let's just smooth it out, he said, but Melissa couldn't stop herself. She fired back one last shot. You should have left it to 4 people, not 1. The irony was thick. She had no issue with the house going to 1 person when that 1 person was her daughter. But now that it wasn't, suddenly it had to be shared. Chet, confused, even said, leave it to 4 people? Scott too? He's dead. Which only made me wonder, who exactly was Melissa counting as the 4th? By the time the call ended, Chet was in tears. The day after losing his wife of more than 65 years, instead of being surrounded with love and support, he was being torn apart by accusations, pressure, and manipulation from his own family. The call broke him. After Lois passed, my parents immediately started working on the arrangements for her funeral. Both of them were retired, so they could make sure everything would be handled. Darren, on the other hand, was still working and claimed that he had a scheduling conflict. He told people that he had to meet with a producer from the Real Housewives of Orange County to try and get Melissa on the show. I couldn't believe he was okay with saying that out loud. But then again, maybe the chance at her first paycheck in over 20 years was the draw. June 23rd, 2022. Lois's funeral. This day was brutal for me. I've always had an aversion to cemeteries and coffins, and this was the day that I had dreaded the most. The service itself was beautiful. Grammy looked beautiful, and after everyone else spoke, it was my turn. I forced myself to stand, and I broke down immediately. I cried, hard, but eventually I pulled myself together and told the story about Grammy's so-called immersion therapy, how when I was younger, she would take me to the cemeteries all across the country because she knew how much I hated them. She thought it was funny, but that was her way of toughening me up. And as hard as it was, I reminded myself that she was finally free from the MS that had dragged her down for years. I also learned that she had been battling with Parkinson's, something I didn't know at the time. She carried that burden quietly. But of course, there were the elephants in the room. Darren and Melissa were still allowed to attend. Given Darren's history and the fact that we knew he always carried a gun, we hired an armed guard for our protection. Thankfully, the service went off without incident, but not without its awkward moments. One relative walked up to my sister Tiffany, and since we have 2 Tiffany's in the family, he asked, the good one or the one from California? Yeah, the one from California was my sister, and yeah, he was a Melissa fan. Oh well, the glances, the sneers from people I didn't really know. I wasn't there to make friends or change minds. I was there to bury my grandmother. July 4th, 2022. A scare with my mom. Not long after, my parents planned to come to my house to celebrate the 4th of July. But then, my dad called me, sounding worried. He said my mom wasn't feeling well and was acting strangely. He begged her to go to the ER, but she refused. I rushed over. When I got there, she was laying in bed, almost like she was sleeping. I asked if she was okay. She told me she was fine. My dad disagreed. I stayed a while trying to piece together what was going on. She finally said that the stress from everything with her sister had been wearing her down. Losing her mom in the chaos had been unbearable. She didn't want to talk about it anymore. Then she said something that floored me. She said, "Everything will be fine. Once I find the baby, then I can go." Excuse me, what? She repeated it. She really believed it. It didn't get any less strange, so we took her to the hospital. The doctor suspected she was having a stroke. She even told the nurse about this baby she needed to find. They gave her a clot-busting medication, and within about 20 minutes or so, she started to snap back. She realized there was no baby. And then she turned to me and asked 4 questions. She said, "Was my mom really dead?" "Yes," I said. "Was Scott really dead?" "Yes," I said. "Was Mark really dead?" "Yes." "Is Melissa dead?" "No." Her reply, "Darn." That's when I knew she was back. She ended up staying in the ICU for 11 days. Her blood pressure was dangerously high, 200 over 100, and the doctors finally said that she needed emergency surgery. They put a stent in her left carotid artery. The doctors were clear. If we hadn't brought her in when we did, she would have died. She was finally released on July 15th. August 29th, 2022. I was at home when there was a knock at my door. A process server stood there with papers in hand. Darren and Melissa had chosen to sue my parents. I don't know why this server came to my house, but I called my dad over to pick up the paperwork, because at the end of the day, it was his fight, not mine. Still, I couldn't help but think, whatever this was about, it had to be a joke. We looked through the documents together. That's when we realized Darren and Melissa had been busy, gathering files and meeting with lawyers long before Lois's funeral. Their goal? To have my dad removed as trustee and to reinstate the old trust. But here's the part that made me sick. The lawsuit claimed to represent them and Lois Holford, my grandmother's maiden name. Who does that? Who files a lawsuit on behalf of their deceased mother using her maiden name as if she was still alive? It was cruel. It was calculated. It was designed to crush Chet. And then I noticed the filing date, July 17th, just 2 days after my mom got out of the hospital. September 20th, 2022, Lois's birthday. This was the first birthday of Lois's that Chet was away from her in more than 65 years. My parents knew how hard the day would be for him, so they spent it by his side. They took him to the cemetery to lay flowers on Lois's grave and then returned to his house afterwards. Ed had a doctor's appointment, so my mom, Kathy, stayed behind to keep Chet company. They were sitting together in the living room when the front door suddenly opened, and in walked Melissa and Darren. Melissa stopped so abruptly when she saw my mom sitting there that Darren actually bumped right into her. And they didn't come alone. They had a special dog with them. Now, Melissa has a habit of over-explaining things when she's nervous, and this was no different. She immediately launched into a story about the dog, how it was for their safety and protection, how it had been trained overseas to respond to certain commands to attack. As she spoke, she set something down on the table in front of Chet. Lois's missing wallet, the same wallet that Chet had asked about before Lois had even passed. Inside were her ID, her social security card, her credit cards, and $3,200 in cash. The cash, of course, never made its way back. Melissa went on to explain that the dog was supposedly Darren's service dog, one that traveled with him everywhere, even got its own seat on airplanes and stayed with him in hotels. Then, Darren dropped his cell phone, and right on cue, the dog snapped to attention, alerting towards the phone and then towards Chet and Kathy. Here's the thing. Melissa and Darren clearly hadn't expected my mom to be there. And considering none of us ever saw that dog before, or ever again, we're convinced its presence that day wasn't about comfort or companionship. That dog was brought there for the same reason Melissa had once told the nurses to stop feeding her mom in the hospital. It wasn't about protection. It was intimidation and maybe an attempt. On November 17th, 2022, I went into the hospital to have my tonsils removed. I was 40 years old, and my tonsils had been causing me to choke at night, forcing me to use a CPAP machine. The plan was simple: take the tonsils out so I wouldn't have to rely on the machine anymore. My dad drove me in the early morning. We checked in before 5 a.m. Everything felt calm. The doctors told me that this was a surgery for little kids. I'd be fine. I even had a nurse who I swear looked like Jennifer Love Hewitt. They gave me the drugs to put me under, and whew, they worked. The next thing I knew, it was afternoon, and I was waking up in a hospital room with my wife and her sister next to me. I was groggy and joking around like I usually do, but then I started coughing up blood. A lot of blood. The doctor who had performed the tonsillectomy rushed back in. He handed me suction to clear it out, but the canister was filling up fast. The doctor looked in my mouth and told me that he had nicked an artery and that I was bleeding out. Next thing I know, I'm on a gurney being rushed down the hallway. Nurses and staff were sprinting. People were jumping out of the way. In the chaos, we crammed into an elevator. The doctor grabbed my hand and said, "Don't let go. If you let go, I have to trach you." I held on as tight as I could. And strangely, I wasn't scared. I felt peaceful. We made it to the operating room, but when we got there, we had to stop. The room was being cleaned. The doctor shouted, "How long?" Someone answered, 15 minutes. His response, "We don't have 15 minutes. And then I blacked out. Next season on The Spencer Files. Just when you thought things couldn't get any darker, Darren and Melissa prove that grief was never enough to stop them. With Lois gone, they launch a full-scale legal assault, suing my parents and the trust, dragging my family deeper into a storm of betrayal. But what they didn't count on was what their lawsuit would expose. For years, they had used Chet and Lois' accounts like a personal payday loan, hundreds of thousands of dollars being drained behind closed doors. Now, with the truth unraveling, their empire begins to crumble. I get pulled into the lawsuit myself. Liz and Darren, once convinced they were untouchable, start to fracture under the weight of their own lies. Their dream house doesn't just slip away, it meets its fate, and Darren ends up behind bars. The gloves are off. The stakes are higher. The fight for the Spencer legacy is just beginning. Season 2, coming soon.